not sure the people at SawStop would want us making this video, but this week we put the SawStop to the ultimate test and find out what's true and what's definitely not true. You're going to want to see this one. A question I get pretty often is, Jason, why don't you have a SawStop? Now, if you don't know what a SawStop is, it's a table saw that has this magical technology that makes it nearly impossible to cut your fingers off, because there's some sort of magic that when your fingers come in contact with the blade, it immediately drops the blade down into the table saw and it shoves something in front of the blade so it stops spinning. Well, I have a little confession. I know most of you have been under the impression that my table saw is a Harbor Freight table saw, but you guys, I've kind of had a SawStop this entire time. I just didn't really want to promote them because, well, we're not sponsored by them, which is why we're able to do this video. I've also heard a lot of myths and information about the SawStop saying that certain things will set it off and certain things won't set it off. Like if you hit a nail, it'll set it off, even though your fingers are nowhere near the blade. Or if you hit wet wood, it'll set it off. So we thought it would be pretty awesome to do a video where we put all these myths to the test and see what will and won't set off the SawStop. Now, if you've never seen a SawStop in action, it works basically like this. You're wanting to use the table saw to do some woodworking. Maybe you turn it on. Oh, your fingers are safe, but the blade is gone. Now, if you're like, what the heck just happened? Let's show you in slow motion exactly what just occurred there. Now, that footage is from my friend Jonathan Katz-Moses. He did an entire video where he shows in slow motion exactly what's going on inside the table saw when you trigger the brake. So I thought he'd be the perfect person to call and ask the nitty-gritty, like the science behind what's happening inside there. So, let's give Jonathan a call. Yo, buddy. Explain to me how a SawStop works.
Okay, so there's 3 volts of potential current running through the blade at all times. It's not actually running through, it's potential. The way that the spring is being held is by a wire. So there's not an explosion like you see in my video. It's actually current. And when you connect a circuit, current travels through that wire, but it has 0 resistance, so it vaporizes. The human body is conductive, so the signal in the saw blade changes when the skin makes contact with it. The spring is just retained, and that's Ohm's law, and it has 3 volts of potential current. Like, you have to slow electricity down. Electricity, I believe, can jump. There's a capacitor, a big capacitor. That wire is sort of like a toaster. Friction causes heat. 200 volt capacitor, Jesus Christ. It like vaporizes a tiny thin wire.
So what you're saying is there's an explosion. Metal, if you're not touching it and you run it through the saw, is it gonna set it off?
I'd say 85%.
All right, then I'm
gonna go 95.
All right, you're 95% confident that metal not being
without
touched
you touching it
will set it
yeah.
off. All right, I bet you a bottle of Weller Antique 107 that it won't set it off.
Okay, that's a fair deal. I'm in.
All right, we'll find out. So now we know exactly how the saw works. Kind of. The bummer is, anytime you set off the saw, you can't instantly use the saw again, because what happens is that brake gets shoved in front of the blade, it immediately stops it from spinning, and the entire thing drops down into the table saw. So before you can actually use the saw again, you have to take the blade out, you got to remove the cartridge, you got to replace the cartridge with a new one, and probably a new blade, because lots of times this destroys your blade. So first things first, before we can test any of these myths, we have to get this old blade out, put a new cartridge in, and start from scratch. So let's get to work. Whew. Now, I was trying to be pretty ginger with that because I've heard a lot of people who bend the arbor of their table saw reaming on this, trying to get it out. So the best thing you want to do is just kind of work the brake out and the blade out back and forth at the same time, just little movements at a time. You don't want to yank on anything. But this is pretty crazy. Look at this. I mean, you can see where this aluminum cartridge shoved itself in front of the blade, completely stopped it. And I've heard that this destroys your blade, but I'm gonna try and get this thing off of here and see what the blade looks like. So let's do that next. Ugh. Got it. It doesn't look like it damaged the blade at all. There's not even a broken tooth on it. These are all carbide tips. I'm trying to see if it's warped, which it doesn't look warped at all. So I'd at least try and use this blade again. It might need to be sharpened, but yeah, looks pretty good. All right, so now we're gonna replace the cartridge, load it up again, and start running through some of these myths. We know that other things can set the saw off other than your fingers because the saw has a built-in bypass mode, so you can turn off the SawStop technology in case you're running some material through that might set it off. But we want to test what are those materials, what will set it off and what won't set it off. And the most common one that we have heard talking to you, the viewers, and other friends in the industry is wet wood. So naturally, we had to find ourselves some wet wood. So we're on our way to Home Depot to see if we can find some wet wood. But it's Home Depot, so of course we're gonna find some wet wood. I don't think they even know what dry wood is. All right, this one literally has more water in it than wood in it. Probably hard to see, but it's so wet. It's so heavy. This one will work. So we have our cedar fence board straight off the shelf at Home Depot. I wish you guys could lift this up because it is so heavy. It is soaking wet. We have our Orion moisture meter from Wagner Meters, 32%. Which is crazy high. So we're gonna test this and see if just a wet board, we have the saw in regular mode, we haven't put it in a bypass mode. We're gonna see if this sets it off. Are you ready? Crazy. I have to say, I fully expected that to set it off. I could literally feel the water being sprayed on my arms as I was cutting that through. Thinking that it might have been a fluke that it didn't set it off, we made sure to run the board through a couple more times all the way past the blade, just on the off chance that it was a false negative. I also realized as I was making that cut that I should probably be wearing safety glasses considering the nature of what we're doing here. We'll fix that in a second. But let's talk about the fact that they specifically have a bypass mode on this saw for running green or wet wood, and it didn't trigger. So is this not wet enough? Luckily, we planned ahead. Knowing that we were gonna be filming this video 2 days ago, we took a board, went down to a local river, tied a rope to it, tied the other end of the rope to a tree, and chucked it in the river. It's been soaking in the river for the last 48 hours, so it literally couldn't be any more wet than it is right now. So if anything's gonna set it off, it's gonna be this board. Wow, we had to hustle. I want you to know that, to go get this board and get it back because we wanted the least amount of time to lapse from when the board was in the river to when we're gonna cut it. Interesting enough, brought it back, set the moisture meter on, it's exactly at 32%, which is what the cedar board was. Although this one is like wet to the touch. I mean, my hands are soaking wet, which leads me to believe either there's a max that the moisture reader can read, which I don't think is true, or there's just a limit to how much water can saturate a piece of wood, and it's right around 32%. But with this being so much wetter on the surface, we're gonna run it through. This is worst case scenario. Like you're trying to build a house next to a river and the board falls in the water, and then you gotta run and rip it down. So you turn on the table saw. I have to say that will wet wood trigger your SawStop? I think that myth is busted. I mean, we could not get any more wet wood than this. And as you can see, nothing. I changed my mind. I want to try one more thing as far as water goes before we put this one to bed. I filled up this old Windex spray bottle with water. I'm going to run the board through the saw while Craig sprays it down with water, and we're going to see if that does anything. And if that doesn't trigger it, I think we're pretty safe to say that wet wood doesn't trigger the SawStop. Nothing. I was even making sure to put my fingers in the water that was coming in contact with the blade, because my thought is the conductivity of the water against the blade would set it off, but nope. Strange. I thought for sure that was going to set it off. I started thinking after it wasn't set off by the wet wood that maybe we screwed something up when we set it off the first time. So just to make sure the saw was in working order, we decided to run one more hot dog through. So obviously the saw was still working. You guys saw that, right? It did not set off with the wet wood. But the magic hot dog, which supposedly is like your finger, ah, darn it, now we gotta change this whole thing again. Another common one we hear all the time is that if you hit metal with your SawStop, it's gonna trip it. But as you heard me talking with Jonathan about, there's a debate whether or not you have to physically be in contact with that metal, or you can just hit metal. So we're gonna test this a couple different ways. We're gonna hammer a nail into a piece of wood, something that might happen if you're running reclaimed wood through your table saw. We're gonna run a piece of aluminum through the saw, which is something that might happen if you have an aluminum fence on your miter gauge. And we're gonna do it both touching the metal and not touching the metal. So let's give this a try and see what happens. This is all in the name of science, so I'm gonna cut into my Rockler crosscut sled. Now this is perfect because it's got this piece of aluminum on it. Now we have this flipped around backwards. You'd never actually run it through in this direction, but this will be good because I can run it through not touching the metal right up until it comes in contact with the aluminum. And then I can also do it holding on to the aluminum, and we'll see what happens both ways. We're gonna try it first with me touching the aluminum because I think that's definitely gonna set it off. So get my safety glasses on here and away we go. Wait, I didn't reset the thing. All right, now we have the saw turned back on. Silly Jason. Ready? Away we go. Well, I'm not surprised because I've heard from multiple people they have set off their saw doing exactly this, not realizing the fence was in front of the blade. So now that we know what's going to happen while I'm touching the aluminum, the real question, and what might cost me a very expensive bottle of bourbon, is will it happen if I'm not touching the aluminum? We're completely reset, ready to go. The only difference this time is I'm not going to be in contact with the aluminum itself. I'm going to hold back here on the wood. This could cost me some alcohol. Dang you, Jonathan Katz Moses. All right, so any contact with metal seems to set it off. But that's a lot of metal. What if you just hit a little itty bitty nail? So we have a piece of what appears to be either hard maple or birch, probably maple, it's pretty heavy, and a nail. I'm gonna just kind of flatten the end of the nail off because that actually helps prevent splitting out your wood, especially if you're going into hardwood. And Gonna hammer that right in there like that. Now I'm a little concerned running this through the table saw that I'm creating some flying projectile that's gonna hit me in the face. So I'm definitely gonna wear safety glasses, and I'm probably gonna put on an apron just to be a little more careful. Wish me luck, all in the name of science. Whoa, that was crazy. It grabbed the nail and drove it the rest of the way into the board. The top of the nail is right there. I don't know if you guys saw, I saw it spark when it came in contact with the metal, and the full nail is still in there, and the saw blade definitely hit the entire thing. Look at this. Very, very interesting. It definitely came in contact with it. Everything's hooked back up. I don't know what to think now. Is it not enough metal? But that doesn't make sense because that's a lot of metal. I mean, that's a full-on nail. Another thing I just thought is it possible that aluminum is just a lot more conductive than this nail, which is galvanized? Pause while we look this up. The thermal conductivity of aluminum is 4.5 times higher than steel, which leads me to believe that it is the conductivity properties of the aluminum that make it set the saw off rather than the fact that it's just metal, if that makes sense. Because obviously it's not just any metal, because the steel nail didn't set it off. And as you could see from the video, sparks were flying, so we definitely made good contact with it. So, I guess if you feel like hitting nails with your SawStop, you'll probably be okay. I wouldn't recommend it, but don't run aluminum through at any cost. Even if you're not touching it, it will set off your saw. One final test we wanted to do as far as metal is concerned is a staple in the end of a board. Now this is probably the most common metal you're gonna come in contact with if you're ripping wood on the table saw, because any wood you buy in a big box store, they always staple those stupid price tags on, and if you're not careful, you leave a staple in there. Will the staple set off the saw? Now, most staples aren't aluminum, so if our prior knowledge is correct, my guess is it doesn't. Let's find out. As you can see, I literally cut right through that staple and nothing. Will metal set off your SawStop? The answer is sometimes, most likely aluminum, but not all metal. Interesting. Another common one is static charge will set off your SawStop. This would make sense because the whole technology behind the saw deals with currents, and if there's a change in that current due to a static charge, well, it makes sense that it would set it off. So we got a variety of different things that I know cause static when cutting them. For example, PVC pipe. I cut this on my chop saw all the time, and there's definitely static buildup on this because all the little fibers get stuck to it after you cut it. But we're also going to try it with some black ABS, see if there's any difference there. Acrylic sheets. Now, I have cut acrylic on the table saw and never had any issue before. However, we also got acrylic mirror, which is the one and only time I personally have set off the SawStop, cutting this. But as we just learned, metal can set off the SawStop, and I'm guessing this has some sort of maybe aluminum foil lining on the back. I don't know, so we're gonna test that. Then we have carbon fiber. Now, I don't know if this causes static, but I thought maybe somebody would try and cut carbon fiber on their table saw, so we might as well see what happens. And then rigid foam insulation. Now, this is very staticky, so I wouldn't be surprised if this sets it off. And I know people who cut this regularly on their regular table saws. So we want to find out if you can cut it on the SawStop. So we're going to line these things up and start running them through the saw. Let's start with PVC. You remember this guy, the crosscut sled I built specifically for the SawStop? If you don't, you can click the little thing up there somewhere and watch the full video. I already ran this through once just to double check. The sled itself is not gonna set off the saw, so we know that's good. I'm gonna use a sled because it's never a good idea to just freehand anything through the table saw, especially round things, because it wants to grab it and fling them away from you. So, this way we can put the PVC nice and firm up against our fence, run it through, and we're gonna see what happens. Here we go. Now I know there's a slight static buildup because it's starting to stick to the PVC, and as you saw, I ran it through multiple times and nothing. So either that's a fluke or PVC's just not gonna set it off. Let's try the ABS. Interesting. So nothing happened. Does that mean there's not a scenario where you're gonna get enough static charge on this to set off the SawStop? Not necessarily. This is a small isolated test. But it didn't immediately set off, which means it's not gonna happen all the time. But why would you cut this on your table saw? Just cut it on your chop saw like a normal person, you goober. Let's move on to something with a little more static charge, like the rigid foam insulation. Now, I know for a fact that this will set off your SawStop because my brother-in-law, who's a woodworker, set his SawStop off cutting this exact same material. But the question is, does it happen all the time or does it have to be the perfect conditions? Let's find out. Now, I cannot wait to read the comment section because I'm sure a million people are going to comment about something I'm not thinking about. Am I grounding myself somehow with rubber shoes? Am I standing on a rubber mat? Did I rub my feet on carpet before this? There's a bunch of stuff that's probably, got to do with the static charge that I just don't know about because I'm not that smart. But our little test here shows that it's not going to set it off every single time, which is interesting. But I do know it has happened. So cut at your own risk. Next, we're going to try acrylic, which to be honest, I don't know how that's that much different than PVC, other than the fact it's a different shape and maybe a slightly different chemical makeup, but we're going to try it just in case. Nothing. It didn't work with the acrylic, but as I mentioned, the one time it has tripped without me trying to make it trip was when I was cutting this exact same product, this acrylic mirror. But it's a foil back, which foil means metal, and we already know that metal will set it off, so that's not a huge surprise. But it only happened the one time, and it was after I already cut 3 sheets of it and nothing happened. So it's one of those not gonna happen all the time. Let's see what happens. Again, nothing. But I'm not surprised because I cut this multiple times and nothing happened, and then all of a sudden, whatcha! Which means it's just one of those things you probably shouldn't do because you never know when that blade is gonna stop spinning. Now, to really test this whole static charge theory, I was trying to think of something that just naturally has a lot of static charge to it. And then I thought, oh, when you take a balloon and you rub it on your head, you build up the static on the balloon, and then you can actually feel it when you touch it. There's just one big issue. I don't have any hair on my head. But luckily, Craig does, so we'll use his head. Well, that really burst your bubble. The last thing we're going to test as far as the whole static goes is this sheet of carbon fiber. Now, carbon is similar to graphite, which means it's pretty much a metal. It's very conductive, so I would not be surprised at all if this sets it off. But once again, there's only one way to find out. Would you look at that? Look at this. This is just crazy, and it amazes me every time. That is the damage that it did on the carbon fiber. The tiniest little nick. But it set it off. One that we have heard time and time again is that the SawStop is great. The only problem is that a lot of table saw injuries happen after the saw is turned off, but the blade is still spinning. Somebody won't think about it and they'll stick their hand down the table saw and it will cut them even though there's no power to the saw. But I've also heard that the SawStop has the technology that it will still work even after you turn the table saw off. But there's really only one way to find out. I'm going to turn the saw on, let it come up to speed, turn it off, and then make contact with the saw blade and the hot dog before it stops spinning, and we'll see if it engages the brake. Ready? Well, how about that? Even if the saw is turned off and the blade is still spinning, the technology is still there to save your finger, or in this case, your hot dog. So this is a goofy one, and I have pretty low expectations, but in reading online what will set off the SawStop, we saw multiple places that said charred wood would trigger the SawStop. And the theory is that when you char wood, you're basically creating carbon. And we know from a previous test that carbon fiber is similar to metal, and it did trigger the SawStop. So potentially, charred wood could have the same properties as carbon fiber and have the same results. But there's only one way to find out. Probably good. I examined this board before we charred it to make sure there was no metal. This board's been sitting in my shop for a long time, so it's not wet. It's a regular old run-of-the-mill piece of pine. The only difference that makes it special is the fact that we just burned the crud out of it. Will this set off the SawStop? I would be amazed if it did. Let's find out. It's still on fire. Here we go. We charred this pretty good. Nothing happened. So, internet, you've failed one more person today, and that was lying to us about charred wood. We've tried metal, we've tried wet wood, we've tried static-prone items, we've tried carbon fiber, we've tried burning wood, all with mixed results. But it got me thinking, they always test this to show how the technology works on a hot dog. But does it work with any type of food? For example, will it work with this sausage and egg breakfast burrito? Let's find out. It didn't even make it through the tortilla. So that means a tortilla will set it off. We've run out of things to test. Although we showed how the technology works initially on a hot dog, which is supposed to be the most like a human body part. But it's not a human body part, which leaves really only one thing left to test. Whoa! Thank goodness it worked. Whew. One thing has to be said. The technology behind this saw is pretty darn impressive. The speed at which it stops the blade and completely drops it out of sight is just mind-blowing. You cannot see it with your own eyes, which is crazy. What did we learn in this video? Well, we learned some things for sure. That aluminum, most of the time, if not all the time, is going to set your saw off, whether you're touching it or not. We learned that carbon fiber, definitely going to set the saw off. Hot dogs and breakfast burritos will set the saw off. Nails in the wood? Maybe. Static stuff? Maybe. I want you to know that none of the findings in this video I would consider to be definitive findings, because I know circumstances that the saw did trip using stuff that we used and didn't get a result. So I wouldn't go relying on this when you're using your saw. You're gonna have to make those decisions for yourself. If it was me and there was any question whether or not something's gonna trigger the saw, it's probably safer just to put it in bypass mode. Just keep in mind, in bypass mode, the technology is turned off, and if you run your hand through the table saw, well, you're gonna be a bloody mess. Until next time, check the links down in the video description for, well, some breaks if you need them for your own SawStop. And there's also a link to our Patreon, to our website, where you can get some sweet merchandise, including our classic finger logo, which is obviously owned by somebody that did not have a SawStop. Can I tell you guys a little secret? I am not a professional web designer, and Squarespace makes it insanely easy to make a professional looking website, and you don't even have to know what you're doing. This is my website. It looks like it was built by a pro. I've got my merchandise, I got tools, I got my plans up here, I got my latest videos, and something very cool. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can sign up for my newsletter. You see, Squarespace makes it so simple to create a newsletter and send it out to all the people that want to know about cool stuff. For example, I am just about to offer a discount code to everybody on my newsletter so that they get $5 off any one of their orders. Typety type, boop, 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 bada bada ba, and send. Now you might be saying, well, what can I use that discount code for? I'm glad you asked, because the cool thing about Squarespace is it is so easy to add products. And there's an unlimited amount of products I can add. You can also add digitally downloadable products, like all of my plans. I upload all the plans for my various projects, and then when you add one to cart and purchase it, Squarespace automatically sends it directly to your email in a downloadable PDF. I don't know anything about custom domain names, how to purchase them, or anything like that. They make it really easy to get your own custom domain. Like, we got bourbonmoth.com, but we also purchased bourbonmothwoodworking.com. If you accidentally click bourbonmothwoodworking.com, well, you should come here. If you want to try Squarespace for yourself, which you should go to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking. You're going to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the coupon code bourbonmothwoodworking. So you can either click the link down in the video description, or I'll put it right here. There. Just go there. Squarespace. Oops.